Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to bring you a breakdown of how Liquid healed world first Chrome King Gallywix. In this, I want to talk about the healers and why they've been chosen, what they're strong, how they succeed, how they set up some healing cooldowns in the fight, what some of the pain points were, and just highlight some of the really cool plays I saw on the world first kill. So first and foremost, they were running with, as we saw for the rest of the race, world first, Druid, Mistweaver, and Disc Priest. Now, if you're not too familiar with these specs and what they really succeed at, you're going to hear the term like ramp get thrown around a lot. And technically, all three of these healers have ramps, but they operate very differently. A Disc Priest ramp, for example, is going to have incredibly high highs. In fact, the highest of any of these healers. They mark all of their allies with the atonement buff, extend the duration, and slam damage to heal their allies. Specifically, Ceri's been running with the Oracle setup throughout all of progression, and as some people noted, he wasn't running Twilight Equilibrium. Like I mentioned in the last video, he was actually running with Divine Aegis, which kind of helps smooth out some of the healing. Now, this is not their logs, this is public log information that I pulled from Heroic Gallywix, but I just want to highlight the really high spike healing that Disc provides, which often can come at the expense of some overhealing. And that's a contributing reason for why the Oracle hero talent is so valuable, is because it redirects 70% of your overhealing to your allies. And that means that your atonements become a lot more efficient, and you can really succeed on encounters where players are spread out and where they're taking uneven amounts of damage, which is very much what Gallywix does throughout the encounter. Mistweaver Monk also has its ramp effect, and it can have some really high highs, as evidenced by some of our charts here, again from some Heroic Gallywix logs. But it also is stacking a lot of different modifiers on top of each other in order to achieve this ramp. They have Xiaohao's Lessons, which is activated by casting Sheilun's Gift, and it gives them a revolving round of buffs. They then take these buffs and then are funneling them into their Chi-Ji Celestial. When they activate it, they're also deploying these Cocoon Shields to 4 allies, and when those shields expire or they're broken from damage, they spread around Enveloping Mist to those allies. And when you are casting Enveloping Mist, you also apply Enveloping Breath, which is another healing over time effect, and increases their healing received. So you have a lot of ways to spread lots of healing to your allies, and you also do it over a much longer period of time than a Disc Priest would. So you have insane passive damage, which just got nerfed, of course, post-race to world first. But you also have some really flexible healing because you can put out a huge burst of healing by stacking all these modifiers together, but you can also sustain it for a much longer period of time than a Disc Priest can, giving you really, really efficient output no matter really what the damage patterns are kind of throwing at you. And it's a little bit more forgiving than a disc ramp. As we've seen a few different times, people get stunned on encounters and they're still able to put out a huge amount of their output from their CDs. Revival is pretty awful in this season. It's usually like 2 or 3% of people's healing. It's just kind of like a little fluff extra cooldown. It is far from the powerhouse of healing you might usually think of. Looking at Resto Druid, they also do have their ramps. They're usually applying Convoke the Spirits and Flourish to spread around a whole bunch of healing over time effects and then extend their duration. But unlike their peers, they don't really have as high of spike healing as the other two will. But the benefit is they get a lot better sustained healing. A huge part of their healing is going to be coming from regrowth and from rejuves. One of the nicest things about having Resto Druid on progress is you can have some really efficient and steady spot healing when you need to sort of triage low health allies when they are dropping low, which is super important on this encounter because there is a very special mythic mechanic to deal with. The bombs that the boss is actually putting out, you need to, of course, sabotage the coils, just like you saw in heroic difficulty, but when you grab one of those bombs, you also have to juice it up with some of the lightning piles you'll see around the room. Once you juice it up, then you can dunk it, and you permanently have a debuff on your character where if you die, you wipe out the entire raid. So what Liquid's done is they've had their mages carrying these debuffs as well as Scott, their tank, because they're about the most unkillable people in the raid at their disposal. That also means that specs like Resto Druid are pretty consistently going to be on like babysitting duty to watch out for those mages and make sure that they are sort of like the first ones to get healed, first ones to have healing applied to them as they're setting up for incoming output, because if they die, it's all over. So they start out the encounter where the boss enters into the mech suit, casts Total Destruction, and this is an insane 30-second hard burn onto the encounter. They start with a CD order of using Smack's Chi G. As we mentioned before, that's applying those enveloping mists, the enveloping breath, and he can sustain it over almost the entirety of the 30-second burn phase. It's like 25 seconds that you get out of your Celestial, plus the hots will last a little bit longer. Then, a few seconds into Smack's Chi G window, they're then having Suri use his Evangelism ramp with Shadow Fiend, and Nick using his Convoked Spirits and Flourish, then chaining it into a Tranquility. So you have most of your healers blasting their major cooldowns at the very beginning of the encounter, and people start using their personals about halfway through towards near the end as the Disc Priest ramp starts falling off so that they can better sustain throughout the incoming damage. And in total, the healers are doing about 500 million healing in the first 30 seconds of the encounter. So it's very, very insane. Afterwards, there's like 20 seconds or so of downtime before the boss is going to activate the Giga Coils and then start dropping the combo canisters. This is a pretty important part of the downtime that you need to start getting these cooldowns back, as the TikTok canisters and fuse canisters are then used together on the encounter on Mythic difficulty. So the boss is going to drop TikTok canisters, which have a static location, and then the fused canisters are dropping on targeting onto player locations. They have the fuse canisters close enough to everybody so that you can have somebody like double soak them. And so you'll often have like the rogue trying to like feign and double soak, some tanks, 3, I believe, even soak with like pain sub one of the times, just to make sure that you can split enough of the damage. And then you of course have to deal with the flat absorbs that are applied per player that is soaking. So you split the instant damage, but then everybody that has soaked that damage also gets an absorb applied to them. And so they start cycling between a lot of their cooldowns to make sure that they are able to heal these off really quickly, because the same negative side effect applies as Heroic, where if you don't heal them off, they detonate and wipe everybody out. Some of the most important healing parts in this first phase are when they get stack canisters going into the suppression cast. And this is similar to Heroic, where it's drawing fire at players' feet, and then there's the Gallywix finale, which is the lightning explosion that goes off. So what they do to sort of counter this moment is basically having the Druid Flourish Convoke together and the Disc Priest Evangel and Shadow Fiend ramp together, so that they muscle heal through, and I kid you not, it's so much output in a brief window of time. They muscle heal through the canister detonations so quickly that everybody is running out of the raid about as healthy as you possibly can be for that final detonation out of the Gallywix finale, which they're running super far out for, and they're also able to get to the next set of ads, which means that the damage that they end up taking from the finale blast is usually not very heavy. Barrier finds a really good spot around the 245 minute mark, because there's certain areas, especially as you get later into the encounter, where it can be difficult to stack together into a barrier. But finding some moments where you have canister damage going out and you're kind of lacking a little bit of healer output to muscle heal them off very quickly goes really, really hard when you're combining it with defensives to start kind of stabilizing people and give the healers enough time for their like maintenance healing or lighter healing cooldowns, things like revival, to like get enough output there to heal those off. Just like you've experienced on Heroic difficulty, there's a lot of phase transitions which can be really nasty, and so around 4 minutes, around 350, they have fuse canisters and TikTok canisters going off at the same time as usual, but it's also chaining into the boss's intermission phase, which can deal a huge amount of damage as well. So to make sure that they have about the cleanest phase transition they can, they stacked Flourish and they have the Evangelism ramp on top of each other to just muscle heal through a lot of the damage. And on their kill pull, they also had the fuse canisters basically get stacked like right on top of each other, which cleaved a few more players than they were expecting. But because they have so much output, or maybe it was by design, I'm a little curious about that one, but they had so much output that it didn't really matter, and they just muscle healed through the absorbs near instantly because of how much burst they have. One thing that Suri has done with his own ramp is Usually you are alternating between smites and penances. A lot of times it was because Twilight Equilibrium, but even if you don't talent into that, it still benefits your Wheel and Woe, which buffs up the damage of your smites. What he's done on a few different occasions throughout the raid, but also on this encounter, is there's multiple moments where he's trying to blast output very quickly, and he's just chaining penances back to back to back to back to make sure that he heals through all this damage as fast as possible. Because unlike we saw at a Mugsy, which features like perma ticking damage that steadily ramps up over time, there still is the venting heat on Gallywix, but it's much less of a rot encounter as Mugsy was. And so you can actually accelerate your sequencing and provide more burst at a bit of an expense to your overall healing. But when the danger moments are like smaller windows, that's where it's really beneficial to start chaining lots of penance bolts together. And I think the same thing applies in a lot of areas on like One Armed Bandit. Once they enter into the intermission phase, there's been a lot of changes for this on Mythic difficulty. You can see the inner circles around the room are filling up with lightning, and they're basically continuously electrifying new sections, which starts causing you to have to dodge in and out of the various semicircles to make sure that you're not getting brought down by like mayhem rockets and extra damage. They also have to deal with some sentries, which are putting out kind of like a similar damage hit as we saw on Mugsy. You just have to interrupt these, and you can constantly interrupt them as they start getting cleaved down by others. And then, thankfully, this area doesn't have huge amounts of healing requirements. The maintenance healing, you might call, the healing outside of cooldowns for the healers, is often enough to deal with a lot of the intermission damage, but they have some like small cooldowns that they've mixed in from time to time to deal with some of the rot damage that might be going out there. Biggest thing onto this is kind of just giving them time to get cooldowns back as they go into phase 2, which is basically the same as phase 3. When they enter into phase 2, the first phase heroic mechanics start kind of coming to light. This is where the cone soaks are coming out around the room. Now, this also starts limiting a lot of their space, since more of the room gets electrified, the more the sabotage has been going out to cancel giga coils. And so this is where a lot of like combo deaths can start happening, which makes it very difficult to sort of like muscle heal and make sure everyone's safe. You still have to deal with blaze lines. You still have to deal with like many tertiary like rockets that are going out all over the place, which means it could be very easy for space to just run out entirely. But the cone soaks are a little different than we've seen on heroic difficulty. You now have to make sure you're spreading out from other players, otherwise you're going to end up cleaving them. And so this is a really beneficial area for really the entire heal composition. I remember talking at the beginning of the expansion about how like one of the big niches that like Resto Shaman had was like spread healing, and there weren't too many encounters that we saw in testing that really challenge your spread healing. Now in Gallywix, there is kind of a tight healing requirement, but I would say not nearly as big of a deal as Mugsy was, where you do have a very limited window to get these heal absorbs off. And of course, you have to be mindful of the mages, even though they're not soaking any of the cone soaks. If you're not healing up the other player that has that negative absorb on them, it could just start wiping out your group. So there's a really heavy emphasis on making sure you can have enough spread healing to muscle heal through those absorbs very rapidly, which is something that Disc and Druid can really excel at. Mistweaver absolutely can have that benefit, as they're basically semi-smart healing from their ancient teachings for like consistency's sake, but they also have to make sure they're going out of their way to be applying Enveloping Mist to the range players to ensure Enveloping Breath is going to cleave out onto them, because they are having players stretching across like a 60 to 80 yard field when they have 2 fields electrified in this encounter. So it can be really easy to get out of range of certain people, but this is also where they need to make sure that whoever's in these soaks is also prioritizing pumping off these negative heal absorbs, and even just general sort of like maintenance healing becomes super important on the encounter to rapidly clear these absorbs and get everybody healthy. This also goes back to what I mentioned before about evangelism ramps, where even if you're applying atonement and you're benefiting from the now 40-yard jump range of radiance that was added in 11.1, which makes it easier for your radiance to apply atonements to more allies when they're spread, that comes into play quite a bit, as does the Piety Overheal redirect, because even if somebody's not in a soak when they're having Suri do his ramp, 70% of that overheal gets transferred into people who are actually going to be in need. So sometimes just pumping out overheal can be a very beneficial thing for a Disc Priest with the way our talents are working. One of the coolest parts of the encounter is how they're actually getting all of the players to soak. We saw some really interesting like blink tech coming out on like Muggsy, for example, to jump around. We've also been having players having to jump off the platform in its entirety on Gallywix. So around the 7-minute mark, they're actually having Scott grabbing his bomb and dunking it to do his interrupt. And because he can't get back onto his platform by himself, they're having Sanghelios run out with him and provide the rescue. They had tried some attempts with Suri to do the grips, but because the platform electrifies so quickly after you sabotage the coils, this makes it really super challenging for the Disc Priest to get back in time. And so if they don't get back in time, they will just be stuck in this electrified field and perish. And so it was a lot safer to have Sang be taking care of it because he can just hover back onto the platform really quickly before the Giga Coils wipes them out. Without a doubt, the most epic part of the encounter is the end, where you go from basically 25% to 0 with only one slice of the room left remaining. And you still have to make sure you're staying spread out far enough for any of these cone soaks. And you have to make sure you're doing enough healing to those mages to make sure that they're staying alive. Even when they're not dealing with these soaks, they just have such little space around the room to position themselves. So any wrong step or these lightning fields that you're seeing that are still coating the outer circles and inner circles of the room, they still deal like over half of somebody's life in damage. So some people, they can cross these fields if they have a defensive up or something like that, but they're really trying to avoid it at all costs. And this is probably one of the most insane parts as a healer, because you have to go out of your way to start focusing on people with the bomb debuffs, because if they die, the entire raid dies, which puts a much heavier triage emphasis on making sure that you're healing and overhealing through the mages and Scott to some degree, but they've said in the past that like Warrior is basically just unkillable, so they didn't have to worry about him as much. But this is where you can really see that the venting heat ticking damage comes into play, because overall it's not a huge amount of damage to like impact somebody, but if somebody steps in the wrong space, you have to deal with suppression and the Gallywix finale that's going out. Somebody takes one hit of some million other ground effects that go into the fight, it is just all over. And so as they get themselves ready for like spreading out for Gallywix, spreading out for any of the missiles that are going out and basically covering the entire room, they have to go way out of their way to start fixating healing onto targets that have these soaks. Blaze lines don't help too much either on the encounter, and this is where you start seeing a couple of people start getting kind of like chipped away. There's not as much of like a raw output check as there is a go out of your way to overly heal these people to make sure that they're going to be safe. And this was like an insane burn from the very end of the encounter, because they had both Nick and Dryny down at the very end of the fight, and they're just trying to piece together enough healing to keep some of these guys safe. You even see the spell warding going out on to fire it up as the last boss burn starts going off, and he's able to survive, cauterize intact, and then finish it off. Really super insane kill, and also a really fun fight to sort of coordinate for the healers. I have to imagine that this is going to be very, very fun when my guild gets a chance to get to it. So that's how Liquid healed World First Gallywix. If I missed anything or you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. And if you're liking these kind of videos, be sure to like and subscribe as well. Thanks so much for watching. Big love to our patrons for making all this content possible. If you'd like to join them, check them out in the description down below as well. Thank you for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch you all next time.